Your goals for learning. Cardiac autorhythmic cells in the intrinsic conduction system generate action potentials that spread in waves to all the cardiac contractile cells. This action causes a coordinated heart contraction. Of all the cells in the body, only heart cells are able to contract on their own without stimulation from the nervous system. In this magnified view of the heart, we see an autorhythmic cell adjacent to several cardiac contractile cells. Action potentials generated by autorhythmic cells create waves of depolarization that spread to contractile cells via gap junctions. If depolarization reaches threshold, let's explore this. Here's an overview of the initiation. Your goals for. During the cardiac cycle, the heart valves open and close in response to differences in the blood pressure on their two sides. These illustrations show the pulmonary semilunar valve, the aortic semilunar valve, the left atrioventricular, or AV valve, which is also known as the bicuspid valve, and the right atrioventricular, or AV valve, also known as the tricuspid valve. The three phases of the cardiac cycle are ventricular filling, which occurs during mid to late diastole, ventricular systole, which includes isovolumetric contraction and ventricular ejection, and isovolumetric relaxation, which occurs during early diastole. Click the illustration to see the left side of the heart. Click the syringe to see dye injected into the superior. The first phase of the cardiac cycle is ventricular filling, which occurs during mid to late diastole when the heart chambers are relaxed. Blood flows passively into the atria, through the open AV valves, and continues into the ventricles. Click on the right atrium to see the atria contract, forcing the remaining blood into the ventricles. This will demonstrate blood flow on the right side of the heart, but remember that blood is moving through both sides of the heart at the same time. The second phase of the cardiac cycle is ventricular systole. As the ventricles contract, intraventricular pressure rises, closing the AV valves. The brief period during which the ventricles are completely closed chambers is the isovolumetric contraction phase. Click the ventricles to see them contract and to see the right AV valve close. The ventricular ejection phase begins when rising ventricular pressure forces the semilunar valves open. Blood is then ejected from the heart into the pulmonary trunk and aorta. Click the pulmonary semilunar valve to see it open and to. In the third phase of the cardiac cycle, isovolumetric relaxation, the ventricles relax and ventricular pressure drops. Blood in the aorta and pulmonary trunk backflows toward the heart, closing the semilunar valves. Meanwhile, the atria have been filling with blood. When the pressure exerted by blood on the atrial side of the AV valves exceeds that in the ventricles below, the AV valves are forced open and the ventricular filling phase begins again. Click the right atrium to see early ventricular filling. Although we have been highlighting the flow of blood on the right side of the heart, remember that both atria contract at the same time and both ventricles contract at the same time. Click. As we've seen, blood flow is controlled by pressure changes. Remember that pressure changes reflect the alternating contraction and relaxation of the heart. Blood moves along a pressure gradient from higher to lower pressure through any available opening. Pressure changes cause the heart valves to open and close, which keeps blood flowing in the forward direction. Over the next few pages, you'll see animated graphs showing aortic pressure, atrial pressure, ventricular volume, and an ECG wave tracing. This series ends by showing all the graphs together. As you view each graph, click the pause button to stop the animation so you can correlate what's happening in the heart and what's shown on the graph. Here's a summary of what we've covered. The cardiac cycle has 3 phases: ventricular filling, ventricular systole, and isovolumetric relaxation. Both atria contract at the same time, and both ventricles contract at the same time. Blood flow is controlled by pressure changes. To see the related chapter outline from Human Anatomy, cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped out by each ventricle in 1 minute. Your goals for learning. Cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped out by each ventricle in 1 minute and is directly affected by heart rate and stroke volume. Shown as an equation, cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. Heart rate refers to the number of times the heart beats in 1 minute, averaging 75 beats per minute for an adult at rest. To see an animation of heart rate, click the heart illustration. Stroke volume refers to the amount of blood pumped by each ventricle with each heartbeat, averaging 70 milliliters per beat for an adult at rest. Stroke volume is the difference between end diastolic volume and end systolic volume. Here's how it works. By the time diastole ends, each ventricle has filled up with blood. This amount of blood is the end diastolic volume, or EDV. The amount of blood ejected during systole is the stroke volume. At the end of systole, the volume of blood remaining in each ventricle is the end systolic volume, or ES. To recap, cardiac output equals the heart rate times the stroke volume. The key factor regulating stroke volume is the amount of stretching that occurs to ventricular cardiac muscle prior to ventricular contraction. The more cardiac muscle stretches, the more forcefully it contracts. These stronger contractions increase stroke volume. Here's an exercise for you. Predict the effect of each physiological factor on heart rate, stroke volume, and cardiac output. Then click the appropriate circle to test your prediction.
Greetings! These compensations only work if the situation is quickly corrected. That is, if blood volume is restored to normal. At first, the body's homeostatic mechanisms, a faster heart rate and increased blood pressure, can maintain cardiac output at near normal levels. However, if the blood volume continues to drop, eventually blood volume and cardiac output become too low to maintain normal circulation, a condition called hypovolemic shock. In these conditions, your tissue cells receive inadequate blood flow and they begin to die from lack of nutrients and oxygen. Well, I gotta go. But one more thing, just don't hemorrhage.
To see videos that show the effects of epinephrine and acetylcholine on a frog's heart, click the appropriate picture. After allowing the heart to beat at baseline rate for several minutes, the heart is then given a few drops of a 1 to 1,000 solution of epinephrine. In less than 10 seconds, a change in the heart rate is observed. Once a new baseline heart rate has been obtained, a few drops of a 1 to 50 solution of acetylcholine are placed on the heart. Afterwards, the heart rate begins to decrease dramatically within 10 seconds. Here's a summary of what we've covered. Cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. Heart rate increases with sympathetic nerve activity and epinephrine. Heart rate decreases with parasympathetic nerve activity. Stroke volume is increased by greater stretching of cardiac muscle cells due to increased venous return, and increased contractility. Stroke volume is decreased by low venous return. To see the related chapter outline from Human Anatomy and Physiology by Elaine Merib, click the heart icon. To test your knowledge, click the quiz button to go to the self-quiz. The blood vessels of the body. Your goals for... Let's look at the general structure of blood vessel walls. The walls of all blood vessels, except the very smallest, are composed of 3 distinct layers or tunics. The tunics surround the central blood-containing space within the blood vessel, the lumen. The innermost tunic is the tunica intima, which is in intimate contact with the blood in the lumen. The tunica intima includes the endothelium that lines the lumen of all vessels, forming a smooth, friction-reducing lining. The tunica media, the middle layer, consists mostly of circularly arranged smooth muscle cells and sheets of elastin. The muscle cells contract and relax, whereas the elastin allows vessels to stretch and recoil. The tunica adventitia is the outermost layer of the blood vessel wall. It is composed of loosely woven collagen fibers that protect the blood vessel and anchor it to surrounding structures. Let's compare and contrast the 3 types of blood vessels: arteries, capillaries, and veins. Arteries are vessels that transport blood away from the heart. Because they are exposed to the highest pressures of any vessels, they have the thickest tunica media. The elastin allows them to stretch and recoil, and the smooth muscle allows them to constrict and dilate. Capillaries are the smallest vessels, the link between arteries and veins in the pathway of blood. Capillary walls consist of just a thin tunica intima, making them ideally suited for their role, the exchange of materials between the blood and interstitial fluid. Veins are farthest from the heart, and so they experience the least pressure. Their walls are thinner than arterial walls, and their lumens are larger, allowing them to accommodate a large volume of blood. The tunica adventitia is the heaviest wall layer in veins. This photomicrograph shows an artery and a vein side by side. Note the thick tunica media in the artery and the thin walls of the vein. In terms of relative size and function, arteries can be divided into three groups: elastic arteries, muscular arteries, and arterioles. Elastic arteries are closest to the heart, where they experience the greatest pressure as the heart forces blood into them. They have the greatest amount of elastin, enabling them to expand. When the heart relaxes, they recoil to propel blood onward. In this photomicrograph of a cross-section of the aorta, note the abundant elastin, which can be seen as wavy fibers in the thick tunica media. Click on this section of the aorta to see it stretch and recoil. The graph shows blood pressure in various blood vessels of the systemic circulation. Note that the aorta experiences the widest variation in pressure of any vessel type.
Hi. You saw in the elastic arteries that the elastic tissue formed most of the wall of that media. Here in the muscular arteries, there's a lot less elastic tissue, but relatively more smooth muscle. These differences reflect differences in the functions or the specialties of these vessels. For example, elastic arteries are closest to the heart, and they feel those pressure fluctuations as blood is forced into them with each beat. They handle this by stretching as the blood is forced into them and then recoiling passively as the blood flows off into the circulation. Muscular arteries, on the other hand, don't face these kinds of pressure fluctuations. Instead,
Muscular arteries deliver blood to specific body organs. They have relatively more smooth muscle and less elastin than elastic arteries, enabling them to actively constrict and relax. Vasomotor fibers of the sympathetic nervous system regulate the activity of the smooth muscle in muscular arteries. Depending on the needs of the body, the vasomotor fibers can cause vasoconstriction, reduction in lumen diameter due to smooth muscle contraction, or vasodilation, widening of the lumen due to smooth muscle relaxation. Small changes in blood vessel diameter greatly influence blood flow and blood pressure, making the muscular arteries critical in regulating circulatory dynamics. Click on the nerve to see its effect on blood vessel diameter. In the graph of blood pressure in various vessels, note that the muscular arteries experience some decline in pressure. Arterioles are the smallest arteries. The larger arterioles have all three layers, but their tunica media is mainly smooth muscle. Click the box to see the smallest arterioles. Feeder arterioles bring blood directly to capillary beds. These smallest arterioles consist of only smooth muscle cells surrounding the tunica intima. Click on the feeder arteriole to see how it affects blood flow through the capillary bed. In the graph of blood pressure throughout the circulation, note that the steepest drop in blood pressure occurs in the arterioles, which offer the greatest resistance to blood flow. Note also that blood flow no longer pulses by the time it goes through. Capillaries consist of only a thin tunica intima, allowing exchange of materials between blood and tissues. Blood flow regulation occurs at the capillary beds. The feeder arteriole brings blood to the capillary bed. The shunt is a short vessel that directly connects the feeder arteriole and the drainage venule at the opposite end of the bed. Exchanges of materials take place between tissue cells and the blood in the true capillaries. The precapillary sphincter is a cuff of smooth muscle fibers that surround the root of each true capillary, acting as a valve to regulate the flow of blood into the true capillaries. Click on the precapillary sphincter to see how it affects blood flow through the capillary bed. In the graph of blood pressures, note that blood pressure is fairly low in the capillaries. High pressures would rupture the fragile capillaries and force. Venules are formed when capillaries unite. In larger venules, both a sparse tunica media and a thin tunica adventitia are present. Click on the box to enlarge. The smallest venules, which drain capillaries, consist entirely of endothelium around which a few fibroblasts congregate. In the graph of blood pressures, note that pressure continues to drop as blood flows through the venules, encountering further resistance. Venules join to form veins. Veins usually have 3 distinct tunics, but their walls are always thinner and their lumens larger than those of corresponding arteries. The tunica adventitia is the heaviest wall layer. In the graph of blood pressure, note the low pressure in the veins. Because blood pressure within veins is low, they can be much thinner walled than arteries without danger of bursting. However, the low pressure condition demands some special. Venous valves are hinge-like flaps formed from folds of the tunica intima. Venous valves are most abundant in the veins of the limbs, where the upward flow of blood is opposed by gravity. The one-way venous valves prevent backflow as blood travels toward the heart. Click on a valve to see the direction of blood flow. In the muscular pump, contracting skeletal muscles press against veins, forcing blood toward the one-way valves. Pressure changes occurring in the ventral body cavity during breathing create the respiratory pump that sucks blood upward toward the heart. As we inhale, pressure in the thoracic cavity decreases. Meanwhile, pressure increases in the abdominal cavity, squeezing abdominal veins. These unequal pressures create an upward sucking effect that pulls blood toward the heart. Here's a summary of what we've covered. Of the 3 types of vessels, arteries have the thickest tunica media, allowing stretch, recoil, and vasoconstriction. Veins have a relatively thick tunica adventitia, and capillaries are the thinnest, allowing exchanges of materials. Blood pressure varies in different parts of the vascular system. At least part of this variation reflects vessel structure. Structural adaptations of veins assist in returning blood to the heart. To see the related chapter outline from Human Anatomy and Physiology,